Hello and good evening. This is another episode of National Divorce Talk Raw. I'm your host, Marc Ruiz Evans. I started the Calixit movement in 2012, and I am the most recognized expert on California secession anywhere in America. Give me a second here. We're going to turn off the phone because whenever I start a show, that's when people start calling. So out of respect to the viewers, we're going to do this. So let's get right into it. The first thing that happened recently, that's the big news, was that the top three secession movements in America met in New Hampshire this past weekend. Liberty Fest was held in New Hampshire recently and included the states Texas, California, and New Hampshire. So Texas, California, and New Hampshire attended. Now, all three of those states are the most well-known states pursuing secession. Certainly other states have talked about secession: Louisiana, Alaska, Hawaii. But recently, if we look into it, those are the three states that seem to have gotten the most attention. Texas followed the political party process and tried to get the idea of secession as a vote through the political party process. Now, it was struck down, but they did follow the legal process to get the idea up to a vote. New Hampshire did also follow a legal process. With that one, they had an elected official propose that to the legislature in New Hampshire directly. Again, that was struck down, but New Hampshire also followed the legal process. And of course, here in California, we have filed the initiative at least 5 times, proving that it was completely legal to do so, to put the question in front of the voters on if California should be independent. So this movement, this meeting this weekend of New Hampshire, Texas, and California is key because it's the three most recognized, largest secession movements in America. They're actually meeting together. This is the second time that they've met. And more importantly, all three have pursued secession in a legal manner, proving that secession is normal. It's reasonable. It's rational, and it's something that rational people can do. So let's show you a couple examples just to prove that point. So we're going to cover this. This is the conference. It's available on my YouTube channel, Marc Ruiz Evans. New Hampshire, Texas, California secession movements meet at Liberty Block. This is Daniel Miller, the leader of the Texas nationalist movement. This is Alu Axelman, the leader of the New Hampshire Liberty Movement. And this is Rabbi Stephen Axelman, who is an officer with the CalExit movement. So the Texas leader, a elected officer of the California secession movement, although he's not from California, he's worked with them for years, and the leader of the New Hampshire secession movement, all met in a panel conference. This is the second time that it's happened, and it's key. I invite everybody to look at the video, in which you'll find out is 3 reasonable people talking about very reasonable things. Just a little bit of background. Here is the story on a separatist movement to pull New Hampshire from the United States gets a hearing in Concord. This is this year, and this is showing that Mike Sylvia, who's an elected official, did propose for a vote to be held on New Hampshire leaving the Union. Now, it was shut down, but he was democratically elected. He did use the legal process. He did propose it, and he did follow the whole legal process to make that happen. Let's take a look at Texas. The Texas secession bill, formally filed in the state legislature. Kyle Biedermann's proposal would allow for a referendum on Texas secession. After touting a secession bill on social media, State Rep Kyle Biedermann formally filed the proposed legislation on Friday. So let me correct that. Texas also had an elected official file for secession. However, Texas also, the year before this, had their political party attempt to put it on up for a vote for Texas to secede. I'm sorry, my words are not with me today. It was a long day. So New Hampshire had a state elected official try to pursue secession legally through the government process. Texas also did. In Texas, the man's name was Kyle Biedermann. In New Hampshire, the man's name was Mike Sylvia. And then in California, we had the independence referendum in 2021. We've also filed that a couple different times, and it basically was going to put on the ballot Do you want California to be an independent country in the form of a republic? Bypassing the California legislature and going directly to the California voters so that we could get the international precedent for secession met, which is that you have to have the people in your would-be nation say that that's actually what they want to do. Basically, in California, we didn't do what New Hampshire did and Texas did. We completely skipped the legislature. We completely skipped any elected officials, and we went right to the voters and wanted to ask them to vote for this, much as they had done in Scotland and in Catalonia. All three manners of secession from California, Texas, and New Hampshire were legal and followed the legal process, proving that you have three different secession movements that know how to follow the law and get results that way. Again, this was at this conference. Let's take a look here at the conference. We'll get right into it.
Very much an us-them paradigm, where it's like, so wait a second, you are saying you have the consent of the governed. Well, we hate it, but let's say we're the governed in that sort of scenario, then let's talk about consent, right? So Steve, CalExit, what's happening?
What's happening with CalExit? Well, what's a nice Jewish boy from New York like me doing as vice president of CalExit? Well, I've been involved in CalExit for, I guess, about 2 years right now. And the reason I'm involved is because I support their right to self-determination and because I don't agree with them on almost anything. And one of the beautiful things about CalExit is Marc Ruiz Evans, who's their president or CEO, had reached out to Liberty Block and my son here several years ago, saying he doesn't think conservatives in this country will let California go. And we let him know exactly what this gentleman just said with his expression. Most of us would be happy to leave our homes at 5 a.m. and push them into the Pacific Ocean. And he was very surprised at that.
So I'm not going to call the rabbi out. I didn't say that I was surprised at that. I said initially I was surprised, and I had asked this before I went to Texas, and they had a secession conference there by the Abbeville Institute, and I asked a room of 100 people about that, and they all laughed. Same reaction here. So when I was at the Abbeville Institute in Texas a few years ago, I think 2017, I said, would you allow California to go? Or do you love California so much you could never see it leave? And 100 people laughed. Here, that was in Texas. Years later, here we are in New Hampshire with a bunch of people from New Hampshire. And he says, would you allow California to leave, or would you fight to keep it there? And everybody laughs. So that proves the point that we have said with CalExit, that most American states are conservative. They hate California, and they would gladly vote to let us go. All we need is 25 states to vote us out, and we could easily be voted out, and the votes are there. I've asked many people this question and got it on record, and the Abbeville Institute speech that we did was famous. It was 100 people from around America saying, yes, we let California go, and it's silly for you to think that we wouldn't. And then here we go. Here's New Hampshire years later saying, well, we'd let California go in a second, and everybody laughed about it, proving that there is a market in America for states to vote for California to leave. Now, I'm not trying to blow up my own horn, but what the rabbi's talking about is that I am the official, most recognized leader of California independence. I do need to make a point that the rabbi stated that I was president or CEO. I am not CEO. Jason Wright is CEO. I'm president, and Rabbi Stephen Axelman is vice president. All three of us came into those positions in the same election. So the reason that Rabbi Axelman is able to talk for CalExit is because he won an election for vice president. I won that same election for president, which really means spokesperson, not head. And the person who runs the day-to-day operations CEO is Jason Wright, and he also won those elections. Wanted to be sure to clear that up. Let's get right back to share screen. However, the rabbi's right that I have been doing this for a while. I've connected a lot of people together, and I am the most recognized California independence leader because I wrote this book in 2012. That started this article by Tom Elias in 2013. Tom Elias is the California columnist. He's well known, covers California policy for about 30 years, and he actually started the first recall election against Governor Gray Davis that saw Arnold Schwarzenegger become governor. This is the first article ever in California's history where they seriously talk about how California could survive as a nation or subnationally sovereign or independent in some manner. That's what got me started. Now, recently I have found out that the top 3 books on secession, American Secession by F.H. Buckley, published very recently. Break It Up, Secession Division and the Secret History of America's Imperfect Union by Richard Kreitner, a liberal, talking about secession in America. And this book that just came out right now, The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future by Stephen Marsh. All 3 books list me by name as the leader of California independence. So I'm not using that to gloat. I just wanted to point out that the rabbi is correct when he's talking about how recognized I am to the topic of California independence. This book mentions me specifically by name as the leader of the California independence movement. So does this book, and so does this book. All 3 of those books are the top 3 books in America in recent past on the topic of secession, and all of them recognize my role because of this book that I wrote in 2012 and this article by Tom Elias. So let's get right into the meat and potatoes. I'm going to cover some of the major points this conference had and whether we agree with them. Now, the first thing is, obviously, I'm Marcus Ruiz Evans. I was listed in all 3 secession books. Jason Wright is the CEO. I'm president. Rabbi Stephen Axelman is vice president. President doesn't mean CEO. It means spokesperson for the way that we set it up. The 3 states that held this conference all pursued it legally. So they're not crazy and they're not insane, and nor do they believe in violence. And they understand the government process. So Texas used an elected official, but they also used the political party before that. New Hampshire used an elected official, and California used the initiative process. 3 separate ways legally of achieving secession from 3 separate states, and all 3 were meeting together and agreeing that people had the right to do this. Also need to point out, as we've talked about many times, America will let California go. You can watch this video. People were laughing. It's only in California where Californians are told, oh, America would never let you go because of patriotism. When you actually talk to Americans, they laugh. They think that's a silly and dumb idea and that we Californians are stupid for thinking about it. And I have to say, every California newspaper that said, oh, Calexit would never happen because America would never let you go out of sentimentality. I've looked at those articles. Not once did any of those articles say that. Actually talk to people in America and ask them. They just assumed it was true. Now we see evidence that it's not. Okay, let's go to Puerto Rico as a potential example for California at 3343. We'll go back to share screen and I'll show you that, and we'll cover that a little bit. Okay, the videos. All right, let's see if it works.
I was asked this a few days ago. Okay. Yeah, my wife's not in the room, right? So we were discussing this in the lead up to the bill with Mike Sylvia on the ground. We were discussing should it be to be a territory full on independence and all that. What I said is, so right now independence is kind of halfway between statehood and not being a union at all. And pretty much what I think would happen is, if you're going to ask your wife if you could go back to being in an open relationship, not going to work. A lot more likely to be successful to divorce or stay. You can't ask to go back to the halfway point. It's if you ask, they might say no, or they might divorce you, which is also fine in this case.
That was at the 33:50 mark, about 33 minutes in, and what they were talking about was, is Puerto Rico a good example for state secession movements? Meaning Puerto Rico's almost like an independent country, sort of, but it's a territory technically. Should states, instead of pursuing full-blown secession, pursue something like a territory status like Puerto Rico. New Hampshire, Texas really didn't seem interested in that idea, but I'm not sure that it's a horrible idea for California. California is already very unique, and California was a territory for a very long time. Actually, no, it was an independent territory of America for about 10 years, from 1836 to 1846, independent from Mexico and America. And while the Americans were pouring in, it was not a recognized territory. That's what I should have said. Puerto Rico, as an example, might work for California, meaning that in the book I wrote, California's Next Century 2.0, I talked about how, Californians aren't saying they want their own military. They're not really saying they want their own flag. They're not really saying they need their own Olympic team. They're open to those ideas. But when you talk about secession to Californians, what they hear is, we get to keep our money here. Any of our gun laws, our LGBTQ laws, our women have access to abortion laws, our protecting the seas and the waters and the trees laws can't be shut down like Donald Trump did, and like the Supreme Court with a bunch of justices appointed under Trump is still continuing to do. So when you talk to Californians about what animates them, they're not saying, oh, I want my own army with a California badge and I want a California flag on an Olympic team. I mean, that's cool, but that's not what motivates them. What motivates them is they want policy freedom. They don't want to have laws passed here in California that are struck down. And they don't want to hear, oh, we'd like to do something in California, but you got to get federal permission, like with universal health care or originally with stem cell research. If they want to do something, they want to do it because they thought it was cool, and they want to do it all on their own, and they don't want to have to go to the federal government for permission, largely because the federal government looks at us as bizarre and weird and takes years to get online with the ideas that we're already thinking. As Governor Gavin Newsom said, I believe in 2016 or 2017, California is 30 years ahead of America. So Californians are saying, hey, we want to do X. Now we got to wait 3 decades for the Americans to catch up and even have this conversation in their head before they're willing to give us permission to do that. International trade deals is one of the big reasons for this. Governor Schwarzenegger criticized W. Bush and Obama both for stalling on our deals. And then gun laws, transgender laws, LGBTQ, and environmental laws also seem to be very big, and people want freedom. Now, perhaps for Texas, they're looking at, big symbols of nationalism that motivate them. Certainly, they bring up their own military bases and their own everything. I'm not sure that's what motivates Californians. And I'm not sure that if Californians had guaranteed policy sovereignty, that they wouldn't be content with that. That would be a version of what Puerto Rico has, where the federal government handles a couple things for Puerto Rico, but then the rest of things, Puerto Rico operates effectively as an independent country. This is much like the model with Scotland that I was looking at in the book, California's Next Century 2.0, where Scotland was a devolved country, meaning that the currency and the military and the nuclear power, and I think 1 or 2 other issues, were still determined for Scotland by London. But everything else, immigration, having an Olympic team, was determined by the Scots. And for a long time, they were very happy with that. I thought that might work for California too. Full-blown secession is certainly on the table, but I didn't want to dismiss the idea of some sort of independent territory status as a way of achieving at least subnational sovereignty as Scotland had it, which I think many Californians would be quite content with. All right, let's go to the next point. Let's go to 3643. Let me show you that.
I just don't see California having, I came up with that I'm wearing MK today, and I've got all sorts of gear on the grantpublic.com. But the reason why I did this was because as I talked to people about secession, I found that most people were still American first. And I think that's the problem, right? They're not New Hampshire first. They're not, and I have a hunch that if I were to ask you all, that Texas kind of has a leg up on this because they just have a history of this kind of talk of Texas being a nation. But so I started this as an effort to get that talk happening in New Hampshire, so people just get this idea like, oh, New Hampshire's better, it's its own nation, and it's better, right? It's better than the rest of the other ones. That's what I believe. Get this kind of New Hampshire pride going in the sense that it's its own libertarian nation right now, not could be in the future, not having to convince someone to make that popular. I'm from California, and so I know I'm doing this here, and other people are working on stuff in secession here, and Texas probably, you can speak to whether my hunch is correct, that you guys kind of have a leg up on this because there's a lot of that culture. But what the heck does California have? I just don't see California having a strategy that, for liberty or not liberty, a cultural strategy that would get it to a secession movement.
So I want to point out this man is incredibly ignorant. Wow. So there was a thing called Donald Trump. And in 2016, it was international news. This guy's saying he's from California. Were you in a cave? Because 2016 to 2018, everybody in California was talking about CalExit. And it was so widely known, it was across all American news and across global news. And here we go. Stanford University and Reuters did a survey on support for secession. Both surveys showed around 1/3 of Californians supported the idea, meaning they wanted automatic secession, and around 46 to 47.5 said they were not against discussing secession. Let's take a look. So here's Reuters, said 32% support, and 15.5% said they don't know or they aren't necessarily against secession, which is 47.5 are willing to talk about secession, and 32% were willing to support full-blown secession automatically. Here is the Reuters survey. It came out on January 25th, 2017. Let's take another look at, here's the whole survey at this page, covering everything and the breakdown by demographic groups. Okay, now let's go to Stanford University. Also did this same survey, also asked the same questions. Are you for secession, not sure, or against it? 27%, very close to the 32% of Reuters, or 1/3 for Stanford, 1/3 for Reuters. 27 versus 32% said they were for full-blown secession. Now with Stanford, it was 19% they're not sure, which means 46%, according to Stanford, were open to discussing secession, and 27% were not opposed. Let me show you that survey again. Here you go. Hoover Institute Golden State Poll, fieldwork by YouGov, January 5th to 9th, 2017. So the Hoover Institute by Stanford University, January 5th to 9th, 2017, and the Reuters Ipsos group on January 25th, 2017, both asked, are you for secession, not sure, or against it? 1/3 of Californians said, let's secede today. That's higher than, I think Texas did a survey showing about 40% were for secession. I'm not sure, but something like that. We're at 32%. And then when you bump up the people who aren't opposed, it's 46.5. So I think this guy is very ignorant because he's saying Texas has a culture supporting secession. You don't remember 2016, 2017, when everybody in California was aware of this idea, 1/3 were for it, and a higher percentage of Californians than any Texas poll said they were open to discussing secession. I just wanted to point that out. All right, let's go back to the next point. Again, 47.5 to 32% of Californians identifies Californians first, not as Americans. The guy was saying the problem with secession before he picked on California was that most people identify as Americans first. Not true in California. I have talked to more people about secession in California than anyone alive. Any reporter, any professor, anybody. I've been in this the longest. I've traveled the most cities. I've done the most interviews. I've talked to the most professors on this. I've talked to more people than anyone. The third that said, I want to secede, do not identify as Americans. They have always, for a long time, identified as Californians. In fact, many times in the movement, we'd have a phrase of 3 people would walk up, one would say, I'm against this, one would say, I don't know, and one would say, I'm for this, and we would say, hey, we're for this, and the person who said, I'm for this, would go, I didn't know anybody else who was like me. I cannot tell you the million times I saw that. 2016, 2017, and even up into 2018, we had about 82 chapters. I visited some of them throughout the Bay Area, Sacramento, Central Valley, San Diego, Inland Empire, LA, Orange County, and the coast, and even far up into Redding and Mendocino County. And we always heard this phrase. I always thought about this. I didn't know anybody else did. Always heard that. So when we hear people saying, I always thought about this, but I didn't bring it up because they didn't know anybody else did. And then all of a sudden, a survey in 2017 shows 32% say full-blown secession. What that says is we're talking about 15 million people who have always thought of California as independent, who have always seen themselves as Californian and not American. And then we're talking about an additional 15% who could be convinced that they're more Californian than American. This isn't a fluke. Apple, the computer giant, prints made in California or created in California on their laptops and cell phones. They did that for a while, years and years ago. California Produce says made in California, not made in America. Apple products don't say made in America. So why did Apple, the technology company, and all California produce that's shipped abroad both say, hey, we're Californians? And why was there no backlash? And why did Governor Schwarzenegger refer to California as a nation state, and Governor Brown a couple of times, and Governor Newsom, and no one laughed at them? Because nobody has any visceral idea of California as an independent nation? Or because we already do, we just don't talk about it publicly? That's the point. All right, let's go. Moving on. American law allows a secession under the law. Spain never did. 4201. Let me show you what he's talking about. So the concern is that Catalonia had a vote to secede. Let's go to that 4201. 4201.
You want to retreat, it's a lead, whatever. You spoke to this a little bit, but next step.
Yeah, so just really quickly on the Catalan issue, right? I mean, it just for some context, the structure there is far different than what we are. That's why I don't ever refer to what we're doing as secession. We're withdrawing our membership in a political and economic union, because that's effectively what it is. But the structure there is a little bit different. And what you had was a regional government there that wanted to push forth with it, even against the objections of the system there in Madrid, right? So that was the source of the conflict. But
okay, so that was the point, and the question was, in Catalonia, they had a vote with international observers for secession, and Spain sent SWAT teams in, beat people up, pointed fully automatic, loaded, and ready automatic machine guns at multiple people, just like communist China did to the Hong Kong people, and cracked grandmothers' skulls open with batons. So you were beaten to a bloody mess, you were intimidated, you had people in masks point machine guns right in your face, offices were broken into, and votes were grabbed and burned, exactly like what China did to Hong Kong. So the question is, if Catalonia had that happen to them, why do you think you as an American state can secede? And here's the reason. Spain's constitution is very different from America's constitution. So in Spain, they literally wrote into their constitution after Franco died in the 1970s, when they were becoming a democracy, that you can't secede without permission of everybody. As Daniel Miller of the Texas Nationalist Movement points out at this conference, there is no statement in the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, or the Constitution, or the Treaty of Paris saying you can't secede. It's not there. Abraham Lincoln said you can't secede, but that's not the law. The law is either passed by Congress, or according to the Constitution, it's either passed by Congress, or the Supreme Court interprets what the law is. There is a decision called Texas versus White. In 1869, following the Civil War, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Texas versus White that the initial act admitting a state to the Union was final. There was no place for reconsideration or revocation, the court said, except through revolution or through consent of the states. Javier Becerra, Attorney General, Kathleen Keenely, Attorney General, Kamala Harris, Attorney General, both these people work at the federal government, and both of them, as you can see, said, yeah, that legal interpretation is completely correct. There was one and only one Supreme Court case to talk about secession, It said you can leave through consent of the states. The Constitution is otherwise completely silent, but the American Constitution says that the American Supreme Court decides all legal disputes, which means we have to go back to this. You got to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court looked at secession one and only one time, and they said you can secede through consent of the states. And as I've talked about in other videos, using the American legal system, you have to go off the most current decision. 1869 was after the Civil War and after Lincoln was dead, which means it is the most recent decision on secession. Lincoln saying as president that's illegal is not the president's job as enshrined in the Constitution. There was no law passed by Congress saying you can't secede, which means the Constitution says only the Supreme Court can decide, and the Supreme Court only made one decision after the Civil War, after Lincoln, and it said you can secede through consent of the states. Just to prove the point, here's the actual arguments from them. But here's also Jason Sorens, a professor at Dartmouth, Michael C. Dorff, a professor at Cornell University of Law, Lily Rothman, history editor for Time Magazine, William Murphy, professor at Oswego, New York University, history department, Clifford F. Theus, professor at Shenandoah University, Stanford Levison, professor at Texas Law University, Danny Sivalos, CNN, MSNBC legal analyst, a liberal organization, Scott Schaefer, KQED, senior editor for California Politics, another liberal organization, Stephen M. Duvernay, lawyer and senior research fellow at the California Constitution Center, UC Berkeley Constitution Center, another liberal, James Rogers, professor at the Texas A&M University Political Science Department, Stephen J. Kaufman and George M. Yen, lawyers at Kaufman Legal Group, which specializes in politics and government, Ruth Ann Robson, professor at City University of New York, Daniel Farber, professor at UC Berkeley School of Law, David A. Carrillo, executive director of the California Constitution Center at the UC Berkeley Law School, all said, yes, you can secede. Yes, there is a way to do it, and it's through consent to the states. And as I showed you at the beginning of this video, that's why the rabbi who's the vice president for the Cal-Exit movement asked people, would you ever let California go? And they laughed, because that proves the point. It is legal to leave if you get consent to the states. And whenever we talk to conservatives in 35 states, they always consent. So the consent is there. We simply need to go through the motions. Let me show you this. So I don't need to show you this. You can go to 4731 and you can see Alu Axelman talk about how the Supreme Court will automatically rule against secession. I completely disagree with him. I have a lot of respect for the man, but I disagree. There's only one court case on secession, and it says you can't secede with consent. And it was written by Salmon Chase, who was a Supreme Court justice installed by Lincoln himself. And the decision came after the Civil War. You cannot ignore precedent in the American legal system. That's not how it works. You have to look at what previous decisions relevant to the case were and base your decision on that. Now, certainly you can overturn precedent, but that's rare. And if we're looking at why this court would overturn precedent, I would say in this case they wouldn't. Why? Because the U.S. Supreme Court now is the most conservative it's been in 50 years. It's not a liberal court, it's a conservative court. Conservatives typically believe in secession. So the court would have to ignore stare decisis, or the way that the whole legal system works, which can technically happen, but is very rare. And they probably wouldn't do it. And B, they probably wouldn't do it because they're mostly conservatives now, not liberals. And they would back the idea anyways. So it is legal. And I think that the court, who has never revisited the decision of Texas versus White and has never defined what consent means, would actually vote in our favor. And I think it's more logical to assume that given the conditions I said than not. Finally, somewhere at the end of the conference, and I'm not sure where, but somewhere at the end of the conference when they do public questions and answers, the question comes up with, why would America let states to secede? And I think it was Daniel Miller said, America's backing up the right of self-determination under the UN Charter now, as we've talked about routinely in Cal-Exit. And this was Jason Wright, the president, the CEO's idea, was to focus on self-determination. So when America joined the United Nations, it had to sign a treaty to join. In that treaty, it says you recognize the right of self-determination, aka a nation to become independent if its people want that. the Supreme Court multiple times, and American law says treaties supersede all domestic laws, which means that the treaty that America signed with the UN supersedes anything anyone in America can say. You cannot overrule treaties. This goes back hundreds of years. So since America signed a treaty saying we recognize the right of self-determination, which is the UN Charter Treaty, then it must recognize that. And what Daniel Miller was pointing out was, I guess they're living up to their word. They signed a treaty with the UN, which supersedes all domestic law, and it says they recognize the right of self-determination. And they're doing that with Ukraine. They're telling the Ukrainians right now, if you want to leave Russia, you can. Why? Just because you want to. You don't have to prove it. Try explaining the cultural and linguistic difference between Ukrainians and Russians. It's murky at best. Try to explain the historical differences between those two countries. It's murky at best. You have two countries where the people largely speak the same language, largely have the same culture, largely have the same history, largely have shared borders with each other, but they're radically different, and one of them has to become a nation and can't tolerate the other. I mean, when you look at modern nations leaving, like South Sudan and East Timor, it was because it was a radically different culture than the other one that was holding them, and they were being actively attacked. So here we have a radically similar culture, but America says, you know what? You guys had a vote that you want to be independent? Done. That's all it takes. You had a vote during the Euromaidan protests. We recognize that. You said you want out, you're out. Similar culture, similar history, similar background, similar, doesn't matter. You want to have self-determination, you got it, Ukraine. That's what America's saying. So why not take America at their word? A people who really doesn't have that different a culture, that different a language, that different a history, but feels that they are culturally and linguistically distinct enough, and feels that the host government is antagonistic to them, can secede. Remember, during the Euromaidan protests, Russia did not invade Ukraine. The Ukrainian government had snipers shoot at their own people, but there was no Russian invasion. So there was no really Russian military incursion into Ukraine, but Ukraine wanted to be free from Russia, and America said, sure, all you got to do is hold the vote and you're out. So judging by America's own standards, all California would need to do is hold the vote, and they should be automatically let out. People say California shares a culture with America. We don't think that's true, but maybe it is. California shares a language with America. Stanford University is doing something where they document how California is a separate language than America, but maybe that's not true. But the point is, it doesn't matter. Looking at American precedent, you could be almost identical, but if you want to leave, even if they haven't invaded your country, you feel you're bullied by them, you can leave, and America says that's totally fine, and they did it with their actions. And here's the other thing. So Russia, the USSR, spent a lot of money in the Ukraine over the decades while it was one aggregated government. They built a lot of infrastructure. Now, when the Soviet Union fell, there were debts to be paid because the USSR owed money to people. But here's the thing. Even though Russia went to Ukraine, and this is Boris Yeltsin, not Putin, going, hey, Ukraine, we built this gigantic gas pipeline in order to supply gas to Europe through your country. You didn't build that, and you didn't pay for that. The USSR did, which was primarily paid for by Russia and built by Russians. So you owe us that infrastructure, or we should be able to keep the infrastructure. By the way, you also have debts to pay when you broke off. Ukraine said, nah, we don't want to pay any debts that we owe you. And nah, we don't think we owe you anything for the infrastructure. We'll just keep the infrastructure and not pay any debts. That's what happened. I'll show you the share screen. So this is the gas pipeline here. During the Soviet Union time, they built these pipelines through Ukraine in order to supply gas to Europe. Ukraine said, hey, thanks for spending your money and your time and effort, Russia, but we're going to keep this infrastructure. And by the way, I know the USSR ended with debt and we were part of that, but we're not going to pay off any of that debt. You know, you can do that on your own. And America said, That's totally cool. Go ahead and don't pay any of the debt back and keep all of the infrastructure, and that's fine, and just ignore them. So going by America's behavior, California should be able to keep all of the federal infrastructure and not have to pay any debts when it leaves, because America literally said that's okay for Ukraine to do to Russia, while saying they recognize the Ukraine's right of self-determination, which they have to under the UN Article, I think 21, which recognizes the right of self-determination. So California should be able to leave, keep all the infrastructure, and not pay any debts, and America should be totally fine with that, or they're complete hypocrites. But I want to leave you on a final note here. The fact is that this is the second conference of its kind. We already had one before where New Hampshire, Texas, and California met. We've never had secessionists from 3 states coming together ever before. The Abbeville Institute had a conference in 2017, 2016, where they brought every secession enthusiast together, no matter how big your movement was. But it's only been in 2021 and 2022 where we've had 3 separate secession movements that are legal and reasonable coming together and talking. Think about that. Not since 1861, over 150, 160 years ago, have you had states come together and try in a legal process say we're interested in secession. I would even go back to 1812 when New Hampshire negotiated with the English to secede. By the way, nobody said that was illegal. So it's been about 150 years since you've seen anything like this. States coming together and saying they want to secede. I've studied secession. Nobody's had these conferences. Nobody's gotten together. These are the only ones. There's one last year and one this one. And if you look at trajectory, it shows it's heating up. I'm wearing my green tie after Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was the first member of Congress since 1861 to talk about maybe states should secede. So if you're looking at a trajectory, you've had 160 years where nobody talked about secession, nobody really organized for secession, and there was no conferences for it. Now we have multiple members. I think Ted Cruz is a senator and said it after Greene. Greene's a member of Congress. You haven't had members of Congress talk about secession since 1861. You haven't had states coming together legally, trying to legally piece together secession since 1861. And it's all gone down in the last year and a half. The point is, if you're interested in independence, this is the best time for it in the last 160 years. Midterms are coming up. Democrats are going to lose hard. Republicans who back Donald Trump are going to win very well. When Trump won last time, the California government, the legislature, literally referred to America as a foreign country in a press release where they said we woke up realizing we were looking at a foreign country who doesn't share our values. That was the entire, I think everybody who was elected in the California government signed that statement. What happens next time? They were able to say Donald Trump was a fluke. He doesn't really represent America, or Russia rigged the elections and not that many people voted for him. We've had the Mueller report, the Senate Select Intelligence Committee report, the House Select Intelligence Committee report, and none of them have proven that Russia actually switched votes. In fact, the CIA started saying Russia hacked the election. They don't say that anymore. Nobody says Russia actually switched votes, which means Donald Trump actually won that election. Now, maybe Russia influenced things, but they didn't switch votes. There's no evidence, and nobody said that. So it wasn't a fluke. Donald Trump wins 2 times in a row. Republicans win who back Trump. Californians are going to have to come to the realization that they really don't share values with America, and America is a place that loves Donald Trump. They freaked out by the mere glimpse of that concept in 2016. Imagine what happens when it's a hard reality and there's no talking to yourself to get yourself off the ledge. It's real. You can't blame a foreign country. You can't blame stupid Americans. You just have to accept America is a place that likes Trump outside of California by and large. When that reality hits Californians, I think the magnitude of their disgust will be by a factor of 10. I was there in the Capitol the day after Trump was elected. The police were on guard. The entire Capitol was swarming with people, and all the cops had their hands on their guns because they were afraid something was going to go on. There were people marching in the streets like they were ready to start a war. There were literally people crying on the sidewalk. You couldn't actually walk the sidewalk around the Capitol without walking on top of people who literally collapsed on the sidewalk and just cried. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. The cops were on edge. The whole Capitol was full of people who were just losing their mind. Mass wailing and weeping to a level you could hear it blocks away. I've covered politics, but we've never had anything like that. So what happens when you don't get to write it off as, oh, it's just a minority and a foreign country made it happen, and that's not real America, and you have to deal with this is the real America, and they like Trump. California is going to secede. So now's the time to get involved. You can get involved. You can see the trajectory of things. Congress members, senators talking about secession, first time in 160 years, multiple states pursuing secession legally, conferences among states on how to pursue secession, first time in 160 years, midterms coming up, the Republican Party still thoroughly backing Trump talking about coming back in 2024. It's all lining up for Californians to be massively dismayed and react worse than they did in 2016 when 32% of them said that they would support automatic secession and 47.5% said they would be open to the idea. Well, that is the end of our show today. Please check out the video on my channel from that conference. Let's take a look at the comments. If they're relevant, we will cover them. If they're not, we will not. Let's see here. Jason Wright, CEO of CalExit. There you go. He was saying the same thing. Red wave. We should be ready to CalExit now because Trump's coming back in the red wave. That's literally what I was saying. And the two issues that we have are talking about this is not a fringe movement, which is why I pointed out you had 3 different reasonable people who pursued legal means to do this. That proves we're not fringe. I pointed out that we had 32 to 47.5% support. That also proves it's not fringe. And that there were 3 states who pursued legal means in different manners to pursue secession, proving there are many legal and peaceful ways to achieve that. Poor Abuela, I'm not sure. The thing of secession seems it's getting popular. That's what we were just talking about. El Scorpio Perfecto. Yeah, since Catalonia. He's talking about the same thing, the trajectory. So I was talking about how the trajectory supporting secession is only going up. That's what El Scorpio Perfecto is saying. We were talking about how the midterms are going to go to Republicans and Trump will probably win the presidency and Californians will freak it out. That's what Jason Wright's pointing out. So thank you for the comments. And we will see you next time on National Divorce Talk Raw with your host, Marc Ruiz Evans.